right. We'll call to order the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology and our hearing on the role of receivers in a Spectrum Scarce World. First of all, I want to thank our witnesses not only for your extraordinary testimony, we appreciate it, I've read through it, but also for your patience and that of our visitors here today as well. As you know, we're all in our organizational phases in the Congress, and we were giving courtesy to my colleagues on the other side because they were having their organizational meeting today. And we appreciate their breaking loose so we could get this going, even though we're a little delayed. So it is what it is. Thank you. I'll start with some opening comments and then recognize my friend and colleague from California. Good fences make good neighbors. Where I come from in Oregon, we know that's the case, whether it's crowded city blocks or sprawling ranches. In many places in my district, the ranches stretch for miles and running out of space isn't a problem. But in our digital world, in Oregon and around the country, we're running out of room. Demand for spectrum is far outpacing supply, and we need to figure out how to use this room we have as efficiently as possible. In short, how do we create good, strong fences to make sure everyone stays within their spectrum bands so that spectrum can be used as efficiently as possible? Now, why is this important? Simple. Spectrum equals jobs. Telecommunications is the most vibrant and innovative sector in America. Spectrum's the fuel that it runs on, but there is a limit to our supply. As our subcommittee continues its work to free up more spectrum, we're also focused on maximizing the use of the existing spectrum. We've taken a forward-looking approach, authorizing first-of-its-kind incentive auctions, and taking a look at making government spectrum use more efficient and more available. This hearing focuses on receivers and how interference issues can impact our ability to roll out new broadband services. While the controversy surrounding Light Squared and GPS is one example, we've seen similar debates involving a would-be broadband provider called M2Z Networks. We've seen it in satellite radio, we've seen it in unlicensed and white space devices. So that this issue is starting to recur more frequently raises an important question. What engineering techniques and smart strategies are available to fit more mobile services in a crowded spectrum environment without having to carve out larger and larger guard bands, big, inefficient moats to avoid interference? And how can we do so without unreasonably increasing the cost of services and devices? Now, the Federal Communications Commission has traditionally tried to combat interference by regulating wireless transmitters and placing wireless services of a similar type in neighboring bands, like a city planner placing schools next to other schools and factories next to other factories. While that's generally been successful in the past, fitting additional users into existing spectrums is becoming more difficult with the accelerating rise of the new wireless technologies and services. Recently, both the FCC and the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology have taken a fresh look at the way we manage interference and suggested that we need to begin examining receiver performance to maximize our spectrum resources. This is in part because receivers are developed to meet current technological needs, not to anticipate a changing spectrum environment. They are built for the technology world of today or even a few years ago, which, as we know, will look very different in just a few more years. Again, we need to be prepared. As a result, the FCC is increasingly either rejecting new users to protect existing ones or turning to guard bands, bands of restricted use spectrum to physically separate the two licensed uses. Sometimes these guard bands are like digging a big wide moat between neighbors when a simple fence will do. Neither rejecting new users nor ordering large guard bands is ideal if we intend to remain the world's most innovative wireless community and economy. Today's witnesses include electrical engineers and a physicist with expertise in radio engineering. So I look forward to your guidance on how receiver performance strategies and devices, as different as televisions, smartphones, and GPS systems, impact our ability to put spectrum to its best use. I'm also looking forward to your thoughts on how to strike a balance so we can accommodate new innovations in wireless technology without forcing manufacturers to waste time and money over-engineering receivers for unworkable future uses. Remember, spectrum equals jobs, and we must make sure it continues to remain a job creation engine into the future. We must ensure that our policies promote continued growth and innovation in this sector without endangering our nation's communications, commerce, and security. We're also looking forward to the full report from the Government Accountability Office, as we requested in our Spectrum legislation, which is now law, as they look at this issue as well. So, gentlemen, thank you for being here. I now would recognize the gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my thanks to all of my Republican colleagues for your patience, as well as that of the witnesses and everyone that's come to this hearing today as the Democrats held their reorganizational caucus. And I had no idea that it would take the amount of time that it did, especially with unanimous nominations, but the speeches went on and on. But so thank you for, again, for your patience. Mr. Chairman, harmful interference between adjacent spectrum bands is becoming the new spectrum crisis. At a time in which demand for mobile broadband continues to skyrocket, ensuring that every megahertz of spectrum is used efficiently is as important as our ongoing effort to free up new spectrum bands. And our subcommittee, I think, has worked very, very hard on this, certainly with the instruction of witnesses, our terrific staffs, and others as well. What happened to Light Squared, a promising company with plans to inject new competition into the wireless broadband market, is disappointing. But unfortunately, that ship has sailed. What's just as unfortunate is that this isn't the first time in which an incumbent has raised the problem of receiver overload. Similar interference issues arose between cellular and public safety radio systems, as well as between satellite digital radio systems and proposed terrestrial data services. These are tough issues. Consumers want their smartphones and tablets to provide fast, reliable broadband service, but no one wants more expensive devices, a potential outcome of setting standards on receiver performance. If we successfully reconcile these competing goals, I believe consumers win, new entrants will have greater certainty before investing billions of dollars, and a thriving consumer electronics industry will not be unduly burdened. Like most members of this subcommittee, I'm not an engineer, and I don't have the technical expertise to answer questions such as how much interference is tolerable, what the costs of imposing standards are on receiver performance, and if such standards were imposed, how many megahertz of unused guard bands could be repurposed for mobile broadband. Recognizing the importance of spectrum efficiency, we included a GAO study of receiver performance in the bipartisan spectrum bill, which was signed into law earlier this year. The results of this study, the work of the FCC's Technological Advisory Council, the TAC, along with the experts testifying before our committee today, will guide us as we tackle these challenging questions and determine whether new legislation, an FCC rulemaking, or advancement in technology, or a blend of these things, I don't know, are the appropriate path forward. So thank you again, the patience of our witnesses. You got to stay longer in Washington. Joy is right. But we really appreciate your being here to be instructive to us. We thank you for your important work that you've done and what you will continue to do to promote spectrum efficiency. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady for her opening statement comments, and now turn to the Vice Chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing on receivers. I can tell you that many in Nebraska are very upset that wide receiver Kenny Bell was not named All Big Ten and have demanded a hearing, for which I appreciate you calling. Seriously, though, we have before us a policy that is especially difficult to solve, as recent disputes over interference clearly illustrate. At the center of these conflicts is the question of who bears the cost of mitigating interference, the incumbent or the newcomer. This transaction cost is a big obstacle to efficient spectrum use. And the efficiency of spectrum use is so vital because spectrum is the lifeblood of the wide variety of wireless services that see ever-increasing demand. Spectrum, like valuable land, cannot lie fallow, or else our economy really bears the cost. The problem before us requires to look closely at the costs involved with mitigating interference. I am very interested in hearing our witnesses' ideas about how best to handle these costs. If the FCC has a role here, what should it be? Whatever the answer is, I understand that our task is to ensure that the licensees are able to utilize their inputs effectively. But we must also avoid the trap of imposing inordinate costs on a single type of licensee or hampering innovative uses of spectrum. I look forward to working with all of my colleagues and look forward to hearing from our witnesses. Yield to the gentleman from Florida.
I thank my distinguished colleagues from Nebraska, and I welcome this hearing. And this hearing is an important follow-up from the hearing of my Oversight Investigation Subcommittee that I chaired. It was held in September, and that examined the FCC's role in the LightSquare network. As we discussed during that hearing, LightSquare's billion-dollar investment has simply been put in jeopardy due to an overload interference issue that's caused by faulty receivers in GPS devices. I warned then that we must not let poor receiver standards result in more interference issues down the road. I'm therefore very pleased that this subcommittee is closely examining the issue and beginning an important discussion on how we can address receivers going forward. Extremely important. I agree with the witnesses today that we should be wary of government mandates that would govern receiver designs. However, I do believe that more must be done to ensure maximum use of our spectrum. So I look forward to their approaches, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Latter, Mr. Guthrie, any comments before we go on? Seeing none, the time's yielded back. Do you have any requests for time on your side, Ms. Christensen? Dr. Christensen, do you? Okay. Doesn't appear we have any other members seeking recognition at this time. So now we'll move right in.
Note this date in history.
They've waited long enough. So let's start with Mr. Passy. Thank you for being here from the Federal Communications Commission. We appreciate your testimony, and I look forward to your comments. And just kind of pull that mic close, make sure it's on, and then we'll avoid any receiver or transmitter interference with your comments.
Good afternoon, Chairman Walton, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee. My name is Ron Rapazzi, and I'm Deputy Chief of the FCC's Office of Engineering and Technology. OET is the Commission's primary resource for engineering expertise and provides technical support to the Chairman, Commissioners, and the FCC's bureaus and offices. I appreciate your bipartisan interest in receiver standards and for this opportunity to testify concerning the role of receivers in enabling spectrum to be used for new and innovative communication services. I'm pleased to report that the FCC's efforts to explore the issue in a comprehensive way include stakeholders, technical experts in both the federal and private sectors. There's no question that without concerted action, the demand for mobile broadband spectrum would quickly outpace the available supply. The Commission has and continues to take numerous steps to meet this demand, including reallocating spectrum, fostering advanced spectrum sharing techniques, and promoting improvement in spectrum use, efficient spectrum use. The Commission's spectrum management efforts have focused primarily on transmitters by establishing limitations on power and noise that they may generate outside their designated frequency bands, while the performance of receivers has generally been left to the marketplace. Receivers are expected to operate within the same parameters as their associated transmitters. That's not always the case because sometimes receivers pick up energy outside of the spectrum provided for their service. Receiver performance is becoming increasingly important as a limiting factor as we move to repurpose spectrum and pack more services closer together. The continuing challenge for the Commission will be to maximize the amount of usable spectrum for cost-effective deployment of new communication services while sufficiently protecting incumbent receivers. If receiver technology remains static or is unable to keep pace with the rapid evolution of the transmission technologies, the challenges before the Commission will increase dramatically. In 2003, the Commission initiated a notice of inquiry to consider incorporating receiver interference protection standards into spectrum policy on a broader basis. The proceeding was terminated in 2007, but the Commission found that nothing precludes it from evaluating the issues raised by parties in the context of other proceedings that are frequency band or service specific. Over the past several years, receiver performance issues have arisen in certain band specific instances as a conflict between legacy stakeholders and new entrants. The Commission is proactively addressing the issue of receiver performance and its impact on spectrum access for new services. Earlier this year, Chairman Janikowski initiated a review of spectrum efficiency and receiver standards with a two-day workshop held at FCC headquarters featuring a broad range of experts and stakeholders, including licensees, equipment manufacturers, and consumers. Chairman Janikowski also tasked the Commission's Technological Advisory Council to study the issue of receiver performance, and OET Chief Julius Knapp has been working with the TAC as it develops its recommendations. The TAC plans to finalize its recommendations at this upcoming December 10th meeting and then submit to the Commission those recommendations for consideration. Commission staff participated as well in various technical groups organized by private sector entities and to discuss ideas about how to address receiver spectrum issues. Staff also met with filter and electronic component suppliers to discuss technology developments that hold promise for improving the interference rejection capabilities of receivers. These efforts by the Commission to gain a broader perspective on receiver performance have been conducted in tandem with OET's cooperation with GAO as it carries out the Job Creation Act requirements to study receiver performance and spectrum efficiency. We look forward to the GAO report and consulting with Congress as we consider what next steps may be appropriate following release of the report. Again, thank you for this opportunity to testify here today. We look forward to working with you and your staff to forge solutions to future engineering challenges, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rapazzi. We appreciate the good work of you and your staff and Julius Knapp down at the FCC. We've called upon you or Julius before for your engineering answers, and we appreciate all that you do down there. We're going to go now to Mr. Pierre DeVries, Senior Adjunct Fellow, Silicon Flatiron Center, University of Colorado, Boulder. Mr. DeVries, thank you for being here. I appreciate your testimony and look forward to you offering it orally.
Thank you, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Ishu, and members of the subcommittee. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here today. Yes, I am the physicist. My name is Pierre DeVries. I've been involved in spectrum issues for about a decade and spent the last 4 years focusing on the issue that is the subject of this hearing today. I laid out my testimony under 4 headings, and I'd like to just summarize the key points. First, the spectrum crunch. The spectrum crunch that matters is the need to squeeze in ever more services into increasingly crowded spectrum, and that requires the ability to improve receivers and radio systems in general to tolerate interference in adjacent bands if they're in a given band. In this regard, I'd like to compliment and commend you, Mr. Chairman, and the committee for your hard work on the incentive auction legislation. That was a vital step in extracting maximum value from this very scarce spectrum. The FCC can also play its part, I believe, by drawing boundary lines more clearly. That is by clarifying both the rights that radio services have to be protected from harm and their responsibilities to tolerate reasonable interference. Second, yes, receiver performance is key. Receivers in one band, or in fact, more accurately, the receivers and the transmitters together as a system in that band, receivers that cannot tolerate reasonable levels of interference in an adjacent band unfairly impose costs on others, and they reap the benefits themselves, for example, cheaper equipment. So far, as we've heard, the FCC has handled such interference almost entirely by placing the burden on the neighbor, for example, by reducing their transmit power, sometimes to zero, effectively precluding the introduction of valuable new services. However, the receiving system operator also needs to bear some responsibility, but it needs to know what that responsibility is. So third, I believe we can go a long way towards solving this problem by using harm claim thresholds, also known as interference protection limits or interference limits, and that's the proposal I'm putting to you today. Harm claim thresholds state the interference levels in adjacent frequencies that a service needs to tolerate without being able to bring a harmful interference claim. No FCC mandated receiver specifications or standards are required. Harm claim thresholds let manufacturers and operators figure out the best way to deal with interference, for example, by deploying suitable receivers. Now, there may well be a few cases where harm claim thresholds won't be sufficient, and additional measures, perhaps even mandated standards, may be unavoidable in a few cases, but they should be a last resort. Finally, Congress and this committee in particular can play a decisive role by continuing to focus attention on this issue, as you're doing, by making clear that the FCC can use approaches that don't mandate receiver standards like the one I've mentioned, and by funding the FCC to commission the engineering studies that are necessary to inform smart regulatory frameworks. So, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my testimony. Thank you again for inviting me today. I'd be very happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you, Mr. DeVries. We appreciate that. I was hoping you would give us your neighbor tent analogy. I thought, really put it in perfectly understandable terms. We'll go now to Mr. Mark Walter, who is the Senior Vice President, Research and Standards at the Consumer Electronics Association. Mr. Mark Walter, we appreciate your testimony and look forward to your comments.
Thank you. Subcommittee Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee, on behalf of the Consumer Electronics Association, thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing on the role of receivers in a spectrum scarce world. My name is Brian Mark Walter, and I'm Senior Vice President of Research and Standards at CEA. CEA's more than 2,000 member companies include almost all the world's leading consumer electronics manufacturers and hundreds of small businesses. CEA and its members have a vital interest and an important role to play in ensuring the most effective and efficient use of spectrum. As we continue to examine how to make the most efficient use of our nation's spectrum, CEA believes that spectrum management must include an approach that examines the interaction between transmitters and receivers. This approach need not cause a shift from command and control spectrum management to command and control device regulation. The pillars of spectrum policy in a world of overcrowded airwaves must include better information about receivers in the field and their ability to tolerate interference, certainty on possible new allocations so that businesses and federal spectrum users may make informed design and investment decisions, and primary reliance on stakeholders to find the cost and performance boundary between adjacent systems. Equipment manufacturers and wireless service providers have a strong self-interest in developing and deploying devices that are resistant to forms of interference and that create as little interference as possible. Service providers require that their receivers meet very stringent design specifications to ensure non-interference. Licensed mobile devices must meet applicable standards bodies requirements prior to use by wireless providers. The two primary examples are the standards created by the third-generation partnership projects. Industry has developed these standards to ensure that items such as reference sensitivity levels, receiver input levels, adjacent channel selectivity, and blocking characteristics are standardized and controlled. Digital TV receivers provide another example of effective response by industry stakeholders to document the RF environment and the associated trade-offs made by receivers to operate in the wide range of expected signal levels. The standard in this case is HSC Recommended Practice A74. CA believes that A74 serves as a good starting point for the industry-to-industry dialogue that is needed to complete incentive auctions and to introduce new mobile broadband services as the upper adjacent neighbor to the TV band. The debate over efficient use of spectrum has moved beyond knee-jerk reactions and entered a thoughtful, solutions-oriented discussion in venues like the FCC's Technological Advisory Council. The early calls for government mandates on device design have faded as stakeholders have come to understand that such approaches are not the best solution we have to spectrum crowding. We look forward to a broader review of the soon-to-be-released TAC report. As we work to mitigate interference between the services and receivers in adjacent bands, CEA offers the following principles to guide policymakers and industry. First, reduce uncertainty. The ultimate goal of spectrum management should be to make the interference environment more transparent so that designers have all the information needed to deliver cost-effective products that allow more efficient use of adjacent bands. Second, use voluntary performance principles and industry standards, not device mandates. Instead of adopting static regulations governing receiver design, we believe the FCC should allow industry to develop standards responsive to planned allocations. Third, collect information. The FCC should continue to carefully inventory what services are operating in each band and work with industry and government users to understand the types of receivers deployed and their interference immunity characteristics. Fourth, case-by-case analysis. Any regulatory action regarding spectrum allocations and receiver performance should be narrowly tailored to allow technological advancement. These principles are explained in more detail in my written testimony. To conclude, CEA is encouraged by the numerous fresh ideas on spectrum policy and the concerted effort to free up spectrum for much-needed commercial use. We believe that the right regulatory approach to spectrum management leverages stakeholders' deep understanding of their system capabilities and price points in response to any government-articulated plans for future allocations. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Mark Walter, thank you for your very thoughtful testimony. We appreciate your being here today as well. I'll lead off with the questions, and I'll start with you, just as you were giving your testimony, and certainly Mr. DeVries. What did you think of Mr. DeVries' proposal for our consideration regarding the harm claim threshold notion of how you might, I won't say regulate in this space, but provide guidance in this space? Is that something CEA be interested in? Is that something you see as workable?
Yes, we're definitely interested, and we should confess it. We're both on the TAC, and so we're both working this issue very carefully, the interference limits approach. There are a lot of details to be worked out yet. Mm-hmm. What's very appealing about the approach is it allows the problem to be stated and doesn't go directly to the solution. So as Pierre described, it sets up the environment and allows the framework, and says, leaves in the hand of the users to build equipment to meet those needs rather than going directly to solutions by dictating specific device performance. There are some complicated issues yet to be worked out about how you would create established limits to begin with and different use cases. But
I appreciate that, and I want to encourage the TAC and its work, and you too, since you're here in public and not back in your TAC world, to continue, because while trying to break loose spectrum is one of the most enjoyable tasks we have here on the subcommittee, it's simple and easy, and there's never any, there's a limit what we can do. And so we're going to be looking at all these efficiencies. Mr. DeVries, the growing need to place varied wireless services in neighboring spectrum bands has prompted the FCC to increasingly rely on guard bands. And that's something that I really want to drill in a bit here. How efficient a solution is that? One of my underlying questions, I guess, is how much guard band, how much spectrum lies fallow because we have this problem between transmitter and receiver? Can you kind of address that piece of this? And does anybody know how much that is? That's not calculated, I assume.
Mr. Chairman, I think the answer is it's how long is an elastic band. It depends on how hard you pull it. To go back to the levels analogy, so let's say I've got a receiver in this band. Mm-hmm. If I set the level of the maximum interference that it can tolerate very low, that's effectively a guard band.
Right.
Right? If I set it very high, it's not. And choosing exactly where one chooses that level influences how much you free up.
Got it.
So that decision, which the way we're thinking on the TAC, probably the discussions start amongst engineers in a multi-stakeholder space, may end up at the FCC, but where that number is set influences how much more we can squeeze it in.
Right. Okay. Well, in my background, I was in the radio broadcast business 22 years and a ham radio, licensed amateur radio operator. And so I played a little in this, and, we had to limit our transmission, can have this exposure. And, we all argued about how sloppy the front ends are on AM receivers, and all the interference you get from power lines and everything else. And so it just has always struck me that there's ability to improve in that side of the equation. So I appreciate that. Let me go to Mr. DeVries. In the license context, there's a licensee on the hook at the FCC that has an ongoing relationship with both the subscriber and the manufacturer. Mm-hmm. The licensee can try to get a solution deployed in the marketplace. But when there's no licensee, as was the case with the GPS device problems in the Light Squared case, it's a lot harder to identify and help the individually impacted customers. So what do you think the remedy is in such cases, short of prohibiting or limiting the proposed new service? Do we need to treat these situations differently from the licensed ones? Do we need to be particularly careful where and how we deploy such devices?
I think one definitely needs to pay additional care to these cases for exactly the reasons that you state. I think that there are a variety of possible solutions on offer, and the ones that are chosen depends on one's assessment of the risk. So the simplest solution is to say, we will set the harm claim thresholds, and we will assume that it's a well-run industry with a lot of consensus, and they will come up with industry standards, and they will sort it out. On the other hand, if one has less appetite for risk, you could say we're going to require manufacturers to self-certify, not have the government tell them how to build their devices, but say it's going to work. And then thirdly, and that's the last resort, but may be necessary, for there to be mandated standards for particular kinds of devices.
Okay. My time's expired. Before I turn over to my ranking member and friend from California, I just want to say publicly that the chairman of the FCC was very helpful to me during the Light Squared GPS issue by making Julius available for a closed-door meeting of engineers from both sides. The poor legal folks and lobbyists were, apoplectic on the sidelines. But we tried to drill down on this in this space to say, is there an engineering solution here? Are there notch filters? Are there other things you can do in this space? So I appreciated his willingness to let us do that. I turn now to my friend from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again to the witnesses, not only again for your patience, but your excellent testimony to us on a very important subject. Before I begin with the questions, I would just like to ask, and you don't have to do it now, but in the majority's memo for today's hearing, it states that the PCAST report recommended the establishment of minimum technical standards for receivers, and I'd just like to know where in the report it says that. We don't find it, and as we're talking about whether there should be or shouldn't be and how much, I think that it's important to have that clear. So it's in the memo, but we don't find it in the PCAST report. But you can get that to us.
Yeah, I didn't.
Yeah, afterward.
Questions,
all right,
so happy
but
to find
I think it's a semi-important point. To Mr. DeVries, you've been an advisor to PCAST, to the President's Council of Advisors in Science and Technology. Can you describe how government users would benefit from establishing objective criteria for harmful interference conditions? And just be as brief as you can, because I want to get through the panel.
Mm-hmm. I think government users would benefit by there being clearer criteria for what counts as harm, which means they would be able to engineer their systems to be more interference tolerant, jamming tolerant.
And by what you putting in place what you just described, does this require technological advances? Are there costs to it? And how open would the defense community be to it, do you think? I mean, in your estimation? Because that's really the largest nut to crack, I think.
The setting of the threshold is just the number. And the engineering that's required is left to industry. I can't speak for the DoD. I would observe, I think, that one of the benefits of having clear offenses is that it makes sharing or coexistence more feasible, which means that it's less necessary, perhaps, to relocate and clear. They may find that attractive.
Thank you. Mr. Rapazzi, thank you again for your fine work and for being here. We've heard today that in reallocating spectrum, the FCC should consider an inventory of services and receivers that are operating in adjacent bands. Does the FCC do this today? And if not, from an engineering perspective, would this information help you to better anticipate potential concerns with harmful interference?
Thank you. Currently, the FCC does not collect an inventory of receivers that are in adjacent bands. We rely on
how do you know?
We rely on the information that's supplied in the course of our rulemakings. Manufacturers who have concerns about interference, whether it's out of band or overload interference, will supply technical information to support their arguments on what their threshold.
But wouldn't it be in the interest of whomever is the applicant to bring forward what's advantageous to their case, and then you rely on that?
That is correct. That would be the earliest possible opportunity, of course, would be when the Commission issues a proposal for a new rule.
I think that's a little squishy, don't you?
Well, that's the first opportunity.
Well, I mean, you may not want to say yes to that, but squishy. But I mean, this is, in this town, people obviously are going to advance, and I think it's human nature to advance the best case possible to advance your case. But if your information is the information you're using is just that, it could be biased, and that's what I'm concerned about. But maybe I'm off on the wrong track on this.
But that information would go into what proposals we present, and we seek comment on those, and we would be able to, if there were assumptions that we made that are challenged by the public, we take that information into account. And usually supporting technical material is supplied in our record to support the challenge to our assumptions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mark Walter, thank you again for what you do. You suggested in your testimony that equipment manufacturers have a strong self-interest in developing and deploying products that create as little interference as possible. I agree, but is this a problem that has been many years in the making? I mean, to help expedite a long-term solution, would you support the FCC reopening a formal proceeding on the matter? Does it need that?
So I think given the time that has passed and the amount of work that's even currently underway, I'd recommend we wait for the TAC report to come out and see what work is teed up for the TAC next year, because I think the interference limits, this notion of clarifying rights and expectations, is being addressed pretty thoroughly. So I'd leave it at that. I think there's plenty of work for the industry yet to do in that environment.
Thank you. That's most helpful. Thank you to each witness, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska, the very able Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Communications Technology, Mr. Terry.
Well stated, just like I wrote it. Thank you, Mr. Walden, for your able leadership over the last 2 years. And certainly the receiver issue is one that you've mentioned many, many times, and I'm glad we have this hearing. I'm intrigued, Mr. DeVries, about this harm claim threshold standard. It's almost a libertarian type of view in how to resolve this issue. I have to work in examples. So the first issue that I have is how do we resolve the incumbent receiver? And so using the GPS versus light squared issue, using the harm claim threshold, tell me how that would require or force GPS receivers to upgrade to be able to better filter out the bleed over interference?
The way I anticipate this might work is when you start, you're going to have a lot of devices out there. We're beginning a transition. So the thresholds would be set very low. So I'm the GPS receiver, very low interference threshold, so that all the existing receivers are protected. That may be so low that no service can be deployed. The FCC might then say, or industry might agree, that 10 years from now, it goes up to here, at which point these receivers have 10 years to build filters to accommodate this increased signal.
All right, that's interesting. How would they know 10 years, how to predict what type of interference or level of interference could occur in 10 years? So is this would the FCC have to come back and say, hey, there's this new standard, so now we're getting back to the standards issue? So is that the way it would work? Because right now these GPS folks can just say, we don't have any reason to move.
I'm so glad you asked that question, sir, because I wasn't clear. So the harm claim threshold doesn't attempt to describe the actual interference environment.
All right.
It simply says, if the interference is below this number, you cannot claim harm. Okay. If it's above the number, then you can. So the FCC does not get into the business of trying to predict what the environment will be.
But just where the threshold would be, the harm threshold would still be set by the FCC. Now, Mr. Rapazzi, add a layer then on the involvement in this plan of the FCC. How long would it take for the FCC to establish a harm claim threshold? And what would be the processes to get there?
Thank you. Well, as we know, currently the TAC is debating on how to flesh out this approach and provide formal recommendations to the Commission. We also have the GAO that is reviewing spectrum efficiency standards, and that report is due by February of next year. We, of course, would have to take the recommendations from the TAC and then the recommendations.
Well, for the question, let's just assume that the TAC recommended an approach like the harm claim threshold.
Right. It would come down to where we would apply it first. If it's applied in a specific case, we'd have to determine what that harm, who the neighbors are, before we could adjudicate whether the harm claim threshold is sufficient to protect the existing services, let alone services that are.
So it still have to be done on a per device?
I think level? It would still have to be on a case-specific, band-specific basis, yes. Okay. Because the interference to a receiver that is looking into space, for example, may be a much lower threshold than for a receiver that is communicating with a broadband advanced wireless system.
Is some of the earlier discussions amongst us was that the FCC preferred more of a standards-based thinking that, I would assume the thinking would be that on a standards base, then it's clear everyone knows what they have to manufacture to or engineer up to. Any thoughts that you could share with us? Is that where the FCC is? Is that where, are they waiting for the report to come out?
I think where we are is waiting for the report to come out. We want to make sure we have all the facts in line before we come out with a specific proposal on how to implement some of the recommendations, including from the GAO. So I think we're in a little bit of wait mode. But nonetheless, we want to be sure that we don't curb innovation. We did have that 2003 NOI that we released. We got a lot of good comments from the industry. Some of the comments still remain today. The sentiment still remains the same. And there was concern expressed in the record there that standards could equate to curbing innovation, and we want to be careful not to be in a position to stop innovation.
All right. Thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. Turn to a friend from the Virgin Islands, Dr. Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you for your patience with us today. I guess I would ask this question to the panel, but beginning with Mr. Rapasi, because I know you're familiar with NTIA's work in managing, in the role of receivers in managing spectrum for federal users. Do you or any of the other panelists think that there are lessons that we can learn from NTIA's approach to setting federal receiver standards?
Thank you. Yes, I believe you're referring to the NTIA study or document that was produced in the 2003 timeframe as well, and they listed several types of standards for the fixed and mobile systems that were operating through a range of spectrum. That, of course, is helpful to know where things are on the federal side as far as where they operate and what their thresholds are for interference, so that when we do get into looking at new uses of spectrum that involve federal users, we at least know what the starting point is.
Any other comments from anyone else? So just go on to another question.
The one thing that I learned from that report was how complicated receiver specifications become and how service-specific they are, and that they tend to embed assumptions about how things work today into requirements that then live on, perhaps past their useful life.
And as things change and new innovation.
Correct.
Just if you wanted to comment.
Thank you, and I agree with that. It's a good reference point, but the federal user is both the user and procurer, manages everything about it. In a commercial case, the allocations are done by the FCC, but equipment may be purchased by a licensee or may be done independently. So there are a lot of parts of that work that doesn't map over from federal use to commercial use. And
Mr. Mark Walter, what tools do you think are currently available to the FCC to incentivize and improve receiver standards?
Yeah, so I know we're all kind of falling back on the TAC report. I think there's some good things that will be documented in the TAC report. The FCC right now, clearly can articulate the emission side. It's less clear what the authority is on regulating receivers, and as we said, we probably need to see what the exact tools being proposed before we decide whether that's the right amount of authority or not. And then, as the previous cases show, they have the ability to go in and work with users in adjacent bands and figure things out. But the evidence I see is that the best case is when the adjacent users, even if they're in conflict, because the problems are typically so technical and so case specific, if they can bring a solution to the FCC, that seems to be the best outcome.
Okay, so that sort of was my next question, which I was going to pose to Mr. DeVries. What role do you think manufacturers of receiver devices should play in setting performance levels or defining a reasonable level of interference?
I think manufacturers do that as part of their business. The discussion about what a good receiver is a negotiation between the provider and their customer. And that is what happens when industry sets standards or when purchasers like the federal government do it.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back the balance.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding back. I think we've each got a few other questions to ask. I'm going to throw one out that's just slightly outside of what we came here to talk about, but it plays into it a bit. And that has to do with the notion of efficient use of spectrum, as opposed to just interference use. But do you all look at things like how much spectrum there might be or more usage capability if you had, for example, interoperable devices in the cell phone world? If you have, does LTE and that sort of thing, does that begin to merge all that in when you're looking at total number of users versus total amount of spectrum? Is that, do you all get into those discussions, Mr. DeVries?
Chairman, I grin because I have great difficulty with the concept efficient use of spectrum. Okay. I don't know what it means. to me, maybe because I'm a geek, it's efficiency is a ratio. It's what you get out for what you put in. The number of frequencies that you put in is not the only input. There are things like investment costs, infrastructure costs, deployment costs. And I think what I try to focus on is how do we maximize the value of radio services?
Okay.
And in fact, that's somewhat of a change from what we've traditionally done, which is how do we minimize interference? We need to maximize value.
All right. Now, bring that down from your physicist level. You know, we work better with pictures and small words. So tell me what that means for us as policymakers. What I mean, from your perch, from your big brain perspective, what is it we can do in this space? I mean, we've kind of got, we all talk about crisis and spectrum. There's spectrum out there right now. I think this is a down-the-road spectrum crisis, and hopefully technology eclipses that. But what is it we should be looking at that we're not?
I think the first thing I would say is that you have to keep all our noses to the grindstone.
That's what we're here for.
As you've said, it's a long-term problem, and everybody's tendency is to punt and not deal with the long-term ones because there are lots of short-term hard problems.
It's not just us. Sorry, that likes the punt thing.
Yeah. But so what should we be looking at specifically?
What I, of course, would be saying is two things. One, to focus on encouraging the FCC to set these clear boundaries. Because I've ended up thinking about interference limits as the minimal effective step that we need to take to make progress on this problem. And I think part of that is to, if you can, remove any uncertainty that the FCC has the ability to do that, because there have been doubts about FCC authority regarding receiver standards. These are not receiver standards, therefore they should be able to move ahead.
Okay. Mr. Mark Walter, do you have some comments along these lines?
I don't think I have much to add. There are some people who are looking at the question of the complexity of band plans, especially for cell phones, which is sort of related to what you're talking about. One of the things that it inhibits phones that can be used across a lot of different carriers and a lot of different bands is the fact that, you know, as we find more spectrum, it's not all together anymore.
Right.
It's scattered around. And so there's a separate part of the TAC working on that issue. It's sort of an unrelated problem.
Right.
But, you know, we conjecture that, you know, there's a time in the future where technology gets better and better, where receivers can be more agile. So
so they can skip across the bands and still.
Correct. And we're clearly not there yet, and we're having some discussion about how accurately we could project when that would happen. And really what you'd like to do is have receivers that are cost effective that can be agile in the future. Then you got a shot at changing allocations.
Right. Thank you once again. I'm going to turn to Ms. Eshu.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be as brief as possible. I just have three quick questions to ask Mr. Rapazzi, and yes or no will do. I'd like to ask you to address the question that's been raised about the need for guard bands. If receiver filters can dramatically improve spectral efficiency. Do you think, based on today's filter technology, that guard bands can be eliminated as an interference mitigating solution, yes or no? No.
No, sorry. No, I don't think they can be eliminated in all cases when you have two adjacent services.
Are you seeing any leaps in improvement of filter technology for public broadband services?
Seeing leaps, no. Seeing improvements, yes. Filter technology is improving. As I mentioned in my testimony, we've met several times with equipment manufacturers and component designers. At the component level, there are improvements being made, mainly because of the demand for more broadband services. The demands are being placed on the component designers to come up with better filters that are sharper and able to better deal with interference issues because they've got the spectrum congestion issues.
So in the foreseeable future, we still need guard bands to separate mobile broadband services from adjacent services, like over-the-air broadcast television?
With current technology, even in the PCS world where they're going to 4G deployments with LTE, remember you have downlinks in one band and uplinks in another.
Uplinks in the others.
Frequency division duplex technology, where there is a duplexer spacing in between the two out of necessity, because the upper downlink channel could interfere with the lower uplink channel if there's not sufficient separation between the two. That's the equivalent of a guard band. It's so it's and this is with the state-of-the-art technology as it is now.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Nebraska.
Thank you. Mine is to the consumer electronic, Mr. Mark Walter. So let's take the, again, GPS light squared interference issue. And now the FCC is threatening or develop their harm threshold, saying that now GPS devices have to have a higher level of being able to filter out the interference. What does that mean to the consumer electronics manufacturers who are making the GPS? What would be the burdens on them, and what would be the potential cost to them to now develop the filters to meet this harm threshold?
Sure. I think the industry, and one of the things we've talked about a lot, and I've included in my testimony, is how important it is to have the industry directly involved in that. And in my mind, ideally, you want the industry to try to develop those numbers, to recognize the problem and try to develop those numbers, because it's very hard as an outsider to understand the cost and performance impact. GPS in particular isn't a communication system, as everybody's talked about. You know, it's a positioning system, so it has different behaviors and how it's trying to pick up signals. So I won't even hazard to guess what the cost impact would be. And the truth is, it depends on where you set the level. And so that's going to take some dialogue about, you know, how much impact do you want to have on this type of positioning system to, in the future, be able to get new use of the adjacent band.
All right, and that still comes back to that it's almost a device, and some specific for the FCC would have different thresholds, particularly on different devices. Mr. DeVries?
I don't think that would be appropriate. That actually, to me, would be a receiver specification. If you build this device, you've got to do this. I believe that it's appropriate to set the harm claim threshold for a service. And so, for example, in a service like GPS, you could have a certain level for terrestrial operations. You might have another level, a different value for aviation. But many more permutations like that, and we get two hands.
That makes more sense to me. All right. Still, it means that incumbents would have a new standard put on them or threshold of harm that was different than perhaps when the manufacturers put the product out, whatever it would be. So they'd have to redevelop technology for the next generation of device. So, all right. I wish I could come up with more questions, but that did add some context to and clarification, so thank you.
The interesting thing in all that is it's kind of what we all go through with updating computers and software.
Absolutely.
And you know, I tried to download a little app on my older iPhone, and the new app won't load on the old iPhone.
Right.
I mean, this is the march of technology.
That's a discussion some of us lay people were having in our office. What does it take is this simply writing new code? Or is the device going to have physical filter device, chips in it? What does it take? Whoever.
I like it.
I'll let the engineer.
Do we have an engineer here?
So this also relates kind of to other questions. I think most of what we're talking about here is a hardware question, what the engineers would call the RF front end, the radio part of the equipment. And so we're talking about things like filters for the most part. This other group that, we're looking at these potential for future agile radios. What we hope to get to is where there's less of that sort of fixed, these components that can't move, they're highly specifically designed, to doing more of this, digitally with processors and algorithms, software as you talked about, but we're not there yet for very many things. Most of it is still much more cost effective. Performance is a lot higher, and the battery life is a lot better to separate out the RF front end. So for now, it's hardware.
Mr. Gingrey, do you have any questions for our witnesses or comments you'd like to make? We have a transmitter issue here. You might want to slip to the other microphone. No.
No.
I think you may have to move up to this level, which you've sought to do for some time.
Sit next to me.
I'm making progress.
Yeah. Watch the seniority grow right there before our very eyes.
Mr. Chairman? All right, we're live. Mr. Chairman, thank you for calling today's hearing on another issue within the realm of Spectrum, and of course that is the receivers. And I also want to thank the panel, these technical experts, in providing the subcommittee with their perspective on this important issue. In my brief time this morning, I'll get right to my questions, and let me start with you, Mr. Mark Walter. Based on your testimony, you voiced support for industry standards as opposed to FCC mandates when it comes to the interference avoidance. Would FCC standards undermine what is already in place, and if so, how?
So in some cases, we already have very good industry standards in place. So I guess if the FCC did something on top of that, I'd argue that it would undermine it, because it would in effect overrule what maybe industry's already done. So what I talked about, this cell phone industry has very robust standards and a very strong test regime to make sure products meet it. So overlaying mandates on top of that probably would have a bad effect. And what we'd like to see is industry work on these voluntary standards, because we think they understand their use cases better and what can be tolerated in terms of cost and efficiency, and then figure out whether there's regulation necessary or not from that point.
Mr. DeVries, do you have a comment on that?
Sir, I'd echo that, because the standards that industry set reflect what their best practices are. Very often the FCC, and Mr. Rapazi can correct me, but the FCC does sometimes incorporate reference to industry standards in its rules, deferring to industry. The difficult issue that the harm claim threshold and interference limit approach is trying to address is not one industry trying to referee interference from Verizon to AT&T to T-Mobile, but from cellular to broadcasting, say, or vice versa. And typically what we've seen is that broadcasters don't often read the cellular standards, and the cellular guys don't read the broadcasting standards. That is an outstanding problem.
Well, let me then move to Mr. Rapazi and shift a few questions for you in your important position as part of FCC. Can you clarify for us whether the FCC currently has the authority to impose receiver standards?
Thank you. I'm here to offer engineering and technical expertise. I don't have I'm not in a position to offer a legal opinion on the Commission's authority, but I can say that the approaches that are being considered within the TAC are certainly within our ability from a technical perspective to implement the approaches that are being highlighted in that process.
Yeah, I was going to ask. I think maybe you just answered the question. I was going to ask you if this was a situation where we in Congress would need to act to grant FCC the necessary authority, but you've kind of taken a pass on that in regard to your level of expertise. Personally, I think that it is unclear as to what authority the FCC has in this arena. Hypothetically speaking, and not to indicate support for further regulation, but does the Commission currently even have the resources to set technical standards for this wide variety of receivers out there? And would Congress need to authorize and appropriate new funding for this purpose under the FCC?
Thank you. Yeah, we do have the technical expertise to deal with the recommendations that come out of the TAC. Again, I think we have the expertise to implement those. As far as funding goes, we're in a position now where we'd have to factor in any budgeting into the next fiscal year budget, and we'd have to address it when we deal with our budget issues for the following year as far as funding new programs at the agency.
Yeah. Well, of course, as I'm sure you all have talked about in your testimony, there are an untold number of receiver devices out there, and for hundreds of different purposes, and we see them all parts of society. So, therefore, how would you anticipate receiver regulations even being implemented? I mean, is this something that that can be done, and how costly would it be if it were? How much more funding would be necessary for the FCC to take on this challenge?
I don't have a specific cost estimate or even a ballpark that I could offer up, but as far as the approach, it would be I would imagine if we apply the approach in several frequency bands, it could be voluminous at first, trying to manage the different type of receiver specifications, as Mr. DeVries had mentioned. Broadcasters are not participating in 3GPP. 3GPP participants aren't participating in the broadcast standard development. So it's going to be new, I think, across different industry sectors on understanding the underpinnings of each of the standards. So I think there's a hurdle there, and it will take some time to get that level of understanding among the different industry sectors. And then as far as incorporation by reference to some of the standards, we're very familiar with 802.11 from IEEE. We're very familiar with the 3GPP standards. So again, within the Commission, we have the expertise. We know the underpinnings of those standards. So maybe it's less of a hurdle for us to deal with that.
Well, thank you very much. I thank all three of you. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. Recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. We are about to enter a brave new world where tens of thousands of domestic drones consume an increasing share of spectrum and crowd into already congested bands. The FAA Modernization and Reform Act passed in February requires the federal government to fully integrate government, commercial, and recreational drones into U.S. airspace by October of 2015. There could be as many as 30,000 drones in the sky above the United States by 2020. Drones can carry surveillance equipment, including video cameras, infrared thermal imagers, radar, and wireless network detectors. Drones may gather information, take measurements, snap photos, use GPS, and communicate all this information back to its operators. All this requires spectrum and raise a number of questions about whether this dramatically expanded use of drones will cause interference problems. But we must also ensure that as drones take flight in domestic airspace, they don't take off without privacy protections for those along their flight path. Drones shouldn't interfere with our privacy, and they also shouldn't interfere with other devices using neighboring spectrum. Mr. Rapasi, what steps is the FCC taking to ensure potential interference problems are addressed as thousands of drones will soon fill our skies? Has the FCC staff met with FAA staff to address what receivers are necessary on drones to ensure interference is minimized? And what are you doing to protect privacy?
Thank you. As far as interference concerns with respect to drones, it's a case of interference scenario just like any other, where you have radio communications equipment, whether it's used for video or whether it's used for controlling the aircraft. We have trade-offs that we have to make with respect to the allocation, whether it's in an aeronautical band, and who the neighbors are, so we can deal with power levels and emissions to make sure that interference is not caused to those drones. As far as working with the FAA, we stand ready to work with the FAA to discuss these issues. In fact, we have a team of folks who deal with the FAA regularly on the Interdepartment Radio Advisory Committee, where not just the FAA, but other federal agencies who are interested in the use of drones participate and discuss technical issues that we deal with from an interagency perspective. And I must say, from a privacy perspective, I haven't been involved in privacy issues with respect to the Commission's work, but I'd be more than happy to go back to the relevant bureau, appropriate bureau, and have somebody contact you directly to answer your question.
Well, today, Mr. Barton and I are releasing the FAA's response to our inquiry, asking how the agency plans to ensure that the privacy of Americans will be protected as the agency permits the large expansion in use of drones in domestic airspace. What is clear from the FAA's response is that they have little interest in establishing privacy protections or public transparency into its current and future licensing process. The FAA is wrong. The FAA is dead wrong on this issue in terms of ensuring that privacy is protected. These 21st century eyes in the sky shouldn't become spies in the skies, preying on the private lives of Americans all across our country. 30,000 drones without insurance that the information gathered is not compromised. All three of you hopefully would support legislation that establishes privacy rules of the sky that ensure private information on Americans is protected before drones are licensed. So the question that I have for each of you is, do you think drone operators should have to disclose what data they collect, how long data is retained, and whether information is provided or sold to third parties? Does the public have a right to know where and when these drones will be flying over their backyards, gathering information about their families? Mr. DeVries.
Sir, I'm afraid I have no expertise.
That's fine.
In that area.
Mr. Markwater.
The same. I'm not familiar with the issue.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you who the experts are. They're ordinary families. And as new technologies take off, they have to be accompanied by the human values which have animated civilization for 5,000 years. And the protection of the sanctity of a family, its privacy, what it does, where it goes, is still central to the identity of us as a species. And I think it's important for this committee to play a role in ensuring it's built into this new technology. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time's expired. Turn now to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mark Walker, you stated in your testimony that an inventory of what services and receivers are operating in each band is an area of spectrum policy that needs more attention. And so I agree with you and have long called for various spectrum inventories to be conducted. Do you think there's a role for Congress here, that there should be legislation that would apply to help bring this spectrum inventory to fruition?
I think at this point we should see what the TAC tees up for next year, because I think this question of the dearth of information on what's out there is going to become critical, and so we may see some work in that area. So I think we can wait for a couple more reports to come out and then address the issue of whether legislation's needed to push it.
And what time next year will this be?
So presumably the TAC would lay out its work agenda early in the year, We've had quarterly meetings in the past, so I would think within the first quarter of next year we'd have both the GAO report and know what the TAC plan's on working on.
Mr. DeVries, as you explain in your testimony, quote, wireless systems in one band that cannot tolerate reasonable signal levels in adjacent band unfairly impose cost on others, notably the operators in those adjacent bands, while reaping the benefits themselves, for example, by using cheaper receivers, end quote. You know, I think this is what exactly happened in Light Square, the GPS case. As you stated, not only is this unfair, but it also prevents the addition of new wireless services that could foster innovation, improve public safety, and obviously create jobs. What do you believe either Congress or possibly the FCC, their role to prevent this situation from occurring again?
I believe the important role that the FCC can play is to foster the definition of these harm claim thresholds.
Okay.
And it can do that by fostering a multi-stakeholder process to bring parties from different industries, different services together. And then, if necessary, to take steps to actually put those values into the rules.
Anyone else have a suggestion here? Mr. Walker?
Yeah, so I think, well, I agree, and as I mentioned earlier, we work on the TAC, so you probably get more alignment on our views than misalignment. I think we're sort of behind the curve in all aspects, so none of our tools are in place to help us get in front of the problem, and that's what we're trying to get to, a point where we can establish what we're trying to do with Spectrum rather than build and then figure out we got a problem after the fact. So we really need to get some of these tools in place and unwind the problem a little bit. It's just not going to be solved overnight.
Mr. Rapasi, you stated in your testimony that better awareness and coordination between entities in adjacent bands would go far in solving some of the receiver problems we have seen occur recently. What do you think the FCC's role? Could they facilitate this process?
Yes, I think our rulemaking processes are open and transparent. We again, make proposals based on assumptions. We expect the folks who have an equity or stake in the use of that spectrum will come into our rulemaking process and challenge our assumptions. If there are concerns about interference, it would be brought up as early as possible in the process so that we could deal with those interference concerns before we go to final rule.
Any other folks on the panel have any other suggestions in how the FCC could facilitate this process? No? All right, Mr. Chairman, yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of time. Chair recognizes the future Vice Chair of the full committee, Ms. Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here and for the hearing. I've just got a couple of questions, and I know you all are ready to depart this room, and we are going to have votes in a couple of minutes. Mr. Rapasi, if I could come to you first. In your testimony, and I want to thank you all for submitting your written testimony in a timely manner. That is always that's always helpful. You suggested in your testimony that the FCC clarify what a license holder's rights are in a band of spectrum, incentivize receiver manufacturers to respect those rights and enforce those rights when one licensee in an adjacent band doesn't play by the rules. So this policy framework, if you will, really strikes me in as looking at three goals. And I want to see if you agree with this. Number one is recognition of a licensee's rights in a given band of spectrum with clear rules of the road to ensure that licensees respect other licensees' valuable property rights. And number two, promotion of new entrants to the wireless marketplace because they would have regulatory clarity from the onset. And number three, accomplishment of the aforementioned goals without stifling innovation in the wireless marketplace by imposing potentially crippling device or guard band mandates. So, recognizing that the Commission's technical, Advisory Committee plans to give us a report on December 10th that could address these issues. I'd like to ask what your professional and technical opinion is on how you would instruct the Commission to structure the rules of the road and to provide the clarity and the guidance on respecting property rights. It's to you, sir.
Thank you. We are, as you are aware, awaiting the recommendations for the TAC, but are also awaiting the recommendations of the GAO. They're instructed by or mandated by the Job Act to have their report by February of next year. We would need to take that information, those facts, into account in a general process where we have input from the public who could be affected by whatever rules we would propose to set up to give them clarity, to identify what the environment would look like.
But I'm asking what your advice to them would be. What would your professional advice be?
I'm sorry, to the Commission or to the public?
Yes.
To the Commission. Well, clarity is good. Clarity allows certainty. Certainty leads to investment. Investment leads to competition and innovation, which is important for this mobile wireless economy. So certainly, in any technical trade-offs that would weigh into the policies that that would be presented before the Commission, the technical issues are one of several things. You've got the legal and economic issues as well, but certainly the technical issues are very important from that perspective.
Yes, specificity and clarity in a timely manner is a good thing. So I appreciated your testimony. Mr. Mark Walter? Yes. In your testimony, you wrote, the early calls for government mandates on device design have faded as stakeholders have come together to understand that such approaches are not the best solution we have to spectrum crowding. Now, I was pleased to read that because as anybody who has sat through these hearings has heard from me, I like seeing industry set best practices and guidelines and standards and come up with those rules of the road, if you will. So in your view, what is the current status of the various private industry stakeholder proposals to address receiver standards, and do you think they're making progress in a voluntary self-regulation working framework? And is there anything out there, any kind of uncertainty or lack of clarity that is preventing the industry from making progress toward meeting the balance between flexible use and greater efficiency?
Okay, thank you. So I think industry, and I don't know if you're aware or not, CEA is one of those standard-setting organizations. In fact, our standards are incorporated by reference for closed captioning, for example. So because I'm close to it, I guess I see that industry is always working on it. Where it might not be sufficient is the inter-industry relationships, as we've mentioned a couple of times here today, where we're trying to put two users next to each other, like cell phones and broadcasters, and to get those industries talking. That level of dialogue needs to be increased. So I think to the extent we have a shortcoming, that it's in that area.
Okay. Good. Anybody want to add anything further to that on the progress or lack thereof? Okay, yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony, your guidance, your counsel, your good work at TAC. I want to thank the FCC for your work in this area. Know that we care a lot about it, and we're going to continue to be involved in it. We'll look forward to the report from TAC. We'll look forward to the GAO report in February as well. The record will stay open for 10 days for further comments and questions. There may be some back to all of you, which would help us in our work. So again, thank you for your patience this morning as we got going, and thank you for your comments and your testimony. With that, subcommittee is adjourned.